People often believe strength fades because time steals it away, as if muscle quietly dissolves with age and nothing can be done. But that belief is the real weakness. The body is not careless with its strength. It is deeply intelligent, constantly listening to what we provide and how we live. Sarcopenia does not begin in the muscles. It begins in our daily choices, especially what we eat and how we nourish the silent rebuilding that happens every single day. Welcome to Vital 60+. Muscle loss with age is often spoken about as though it were gravity itself, something fixed, unquestionable, and beyond influence. Yet the body does not operate on inevitability. It operates on information. Every cell responds to signals, and over decades those signals shape whether muscle tissue is preserved or quietly dismantled. What we call aging is, in many ways, the accumulation of instructions the body has been receiving all along. When nourishment is incomplete or poorly structured, the body adapts by becoming economical. It reduces what it considers expensive tissue, and muscle is metabolically costly. Sarcopenia, then, is not a sudden failure of the body, but a long conversation between diet, metabolism, and cellular survival. Muscle is not passive material. It is highly responsive tissue that listens closely to what arrives in the bloodstream after every meal. Amino acids are not merely building blocks. They are messengers. Certain amino acids tell muscle cells that resources are available, that repair is worthwhile, that strength is safe to maintain. When these signals are weak or inconsistent, muscle cells slowly shift into a state of conservation. They break down more than they rebuild, not out of malfunction, but out of biological wisdom. The body is always choosing survival first, and when nutrition does not reliably support muscle maintenance, survival favors reduction rather than renewal. As people age, appetite often decreases, digestion becomes less efficient, and food choices tend to simplify. This combination creates a subtle but persistent deficit, not always in calories, but in quality. A person may eat enough to feel full, yet still fail to deliver the essential amino acids required to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Over time, muscles receive the message that growth is unnecessary or even unsafe. This is why muscle loss can occur even in individuals who appear to eat regularly. Quantity masks the absence of the specific signals muscle tissue needs to stay metabolically active. Another overlooked aspect is that aging muscles become less sensitive to amino acids, a phenomenon sometimes described as anabolic resistance. This does not mean muscles stop responding. It means they require clearer, stronger signals. In younger years, minimal protein intake may be enough to trigger repair. Later in life, the same intake produces silence. The tragedy is that many interpret this silence as biological decline rather than a call for better signaling. When the body asks for clarity and receives none, it adapts by lowering its expectations. Protein quality becomes central here. Not all proteins speak the same language to muscle cells. Some arrive incomplete, missing key amino acids that initiate repair pathways. Others are poorly absorbed, fragmented before they can be effectively used. The body does not measure effort. It measures availability. If the bloodstream lacks the necessary components, muscle cells cannot justify the energy required to rebuild. This is why muscle loss is often misattributed to inactivity alone, when in reality, the biochemical environment is equally decisive. There is also a psychological layer that quietly reinforces this process. Many people accept weakness as normal and reduce physical demand accordingly. The body interprets this reduction as confirmation that muscle is no longer required. Biology is deeply economical. What is not used, not fed, and not signaled as valuable is gradually withdrawn. This is not punishment. It is adaptation. Yet adaptation can be redirected when signals change. Muscle tissue serves functions far beyond movement. It is a reservoir of amino acids during illness, a regulator of blood sugar, and a protector against metabolic instability. When muscle mass declines, the body becomes more vulnerable to stress, infection, and injury. From a biological perspective, maintaining muscle is an investment in resilience. The body understands this, but it will only invest when resources are sufficient. Without proper nourishment, muscle preservation becomes a liability rather than an asset. The modern diet often exacerbates this problem by prioritizing convenience over completeness. Highly processed foods may provide energy but lack the structural components required for tissue maintenance. Over years, this creates a body that is fueled but undernourished. Muscles shrink not because energy is absent, but because the materials for repair are missing. This distinction is critical, as it reframes sarcopenia from a mystery of aging to a predictable outcome of long-term nutritional signaling. What is remarkable is how responsive the body remains even later in life. When high-quality protein and essential nutrients are reintroduced consistently, muscle tissue often responds with renewed activity. Cells that appear dormant begin to rebuild, not because age has been reversed, but because the environment has changed. Biology is less concerned with chronology than with conditions. Provide the right conditions, and the body often exceeds expectations. This understanding shifts responsibility without assigning blame. Many people were never taught how deeply nutrition communicates with muscle tissue. They followed cultural norms, dietary trends, and simplified health advice. Sarcopenia emerges quietly years after the original signals were sent. Recognizing this allows for compassion, both toward oneself and others. The body was never failing. It was responding logically to the information it was given. When we see muscle loss as a nutritional conversation rather than a genetic destiny, intervention becomes possible. Not aggressive, not extreme, but intentional. Feeding the body in a way that consistently affirms strength sends a message that muscle is still needed, still valued, still safe to maintain. Over time, that message reshapes metabolism, posture, balance, and confidence. Strength returns not as youthful force, but as steady capability. The deeper lesson is that aging is not a uniform process, but a personalized reflection of how the body has been supported. Muscles do not disappear overnight. They fade gradually, quietly, following years of subtle instruction. Change the instruction, and the story begins to shift. The body listens patiently, waiting for clarity. Waiting for nourishment that speaks its language. Waiting for signals that say building is worth the effort. That strength still has a place, that resilience is not only permitted but encouraged. That survival no longer requires shrinking, that there is enough. That the future is not something to retreat from but something the body can still prepare for. One signal at a time, one meal at a time, one quiet biological decision unfolding beneath awareness as cells adjust, respond, and recalibrate their priorities based on what arrives next. The idea that a single traditional food can solve the complex problem of muscle loss is deeply appealing, especially when that food carries the comfort of history and simplicity. Bone broth has earned such a reputation, often described as nourishing, strengthening, and restorative. While it does provide certain beneficial compounds, the body does not build muscle on sentiment or tradition alone. Muscle tissue is precise in its demands. It responds to specific biological signals, and those signals are delivered primarily through complete amino acids that activate growth pathways inside muscle cells. Without these signals, nourishment remains incomplete, regardless of how wholesome a food may appear. Muscle repair and growth depend on a carefully orchestrated process known as muscle protein synthesis. This process does not begin simply because protein is present, but because particular amino acids cross a threshold that tells muscle cells resources are sufficient. Among these, some act less like bricks and more like switches. They initiate the entire rebuilding sequence. When these amino acids are absent or present only in small amounts, the body may still digest the food, absorb nutrients, and even feel satisfied, yet muscle cells remain metabolically quiet. They wait, conserving energy, choosing not to rebuild. Collagen-rich foods, including bone broth, are structurally different from complete proteins. Collagen lacks several essential amino acids required to trigger muscle protein synthesis effectively. This does not make collagen useless. It supports connective tissue, skin, and joints. But muscle tissue has different priorities. It requires a full spectrum of essential amino acids in proportions that mirror its own structure. When these are missing, muscle cells cannot assemble new fibers, no matter how much collagen circulates in the bloodstream. The misunderstanding arises because protein is often spoken of as a single category, when in reality, proteins vary greatly in biological value. The body does not simply count grams. It evaluates composition and usability. A protein source that is incomplete forces the body to compensate by breaking down its own tissue to supply missing components. In younger years, this compensation may go unnoticed. Over time, however, it contributes to gradual muscle depletion. The body quietly reallocates resources, prioritizing immediate survival needs over long-term strength. As people age, this issue becomes more pronounced. Digestive efficiency declines, and the margin for nutritional error narrows. The body becomes less forgiving of incomplete nourishment. What once was sufficient becomes marginal. Relying heavily on foods that lack essential amino acids can accelerate muscle loss, not because those foods are harmful, but because they crowd out what is necessary. The body receives calories, warmth, and comfort, but not the clear instruction to rebuild muscle. Another layer to this problem is the role of appetite and perception. Foods like bone broth are often consumed when appetite is low, illness is present, or digestion feels fragile. In these moments, they are soothing and appropriate. The issue arises when such foods become dietary anchors rather than supplements. Muscle tissue interprets this pattern as a long-term reduction in available building materials. Over weeks and months, the message becomes consistent enough to alter muscle metabolism. Muscle cells are deeply pragmatic. They do not operate on hope or intention. They respond to chemical evidence. When essential amino acids arrive in sufficient concentration, signaling pathways activate, genes involved in repair are expressed, and protein assembly begins. When those amino acids do not arrive, the machinery remains idle. This is why individuals can exercise regularly yet continue to lose muscle if nutritional signaling is inadequate. Movement alone cannot override biochemical silence. There is also a misconception that collagen can somehow convert into muscle protein once consumed. While the body can repurpose amino acids to a degree, this process is inefficient and limited. Missing essential amino acids cannot be manufactured internally. They must be supplied. Without them, muscle repair stalls. The body may still maintain basic function, but strength slowly erodes. This erosion is subtle, often mistaken for normal aging, when it is actually a predictable response to incomplete input. Whole, high-quality protein sources provide not only the necessary amino acids, but also the metabolic context muscle cells recognize as supportive. These foods tend to come with minerals, fats, and cofactors that improve absorption and utilization. The body does not separate nutrients in isolation. It processes them as integrated information packages. When those packages align with muscle needs, repair becomes efficient and sustainable. The danger of focusing on a single food solution is that it simplifies a system that thrives on balance. Muscle is adaptive tissue, constantly remodeled in response to load, hormones, and nutrition. Removing any one of these inputs weakens the signal. When protein quality is compromised, even optimal exercise and adequate calories may fail to preserve muscle mass. This is not because the body is stubborn, but because it is precise. Reframing nutrition in this way restores agency. Muscle loss is no longer a vague consequence of aging, but a response that can be redirected by improving the clarity of nutritional signals. When meals consistently deliver complete amino acids in sufficient amounts, muscle cells re-engage. Repair resumes. Strength stabilizes. This process does not require excess or extremes, only consistency and adequacy. The deeper lesson is that the body is not impressed by trends, labels, or traditions. It responds to what works at the cellular level. Foods that support muscle health do so because they align with biological requirements, not because they are popular or comforting. Recognizing this allows nourishment to become intentional rather than symbolic. When muscle is fed properly, the body shifts from conservation to investment. It begins to allocate energy toward repair rather than breakdown. Over time, this changes posture, balance, metabolic health, and confidence. Strength returns quietly, without spectacle, as cells respond to signals they recognize and trust. The body does not need persuasion. It needs clarity. Provide the right information. And muscle tissue responds accordingly, rebuilding fiber by fiber. Restoring function not as an act of defiance against age, but as a natural outcome of being properly supplied, properly signaled, and finally given what it has been waiting for all along. Muscle is often imagined as a mechanical structure, something that moves bones and generates force, yet its most profound role is metabolic. Long before weakness is felt in the limbs, changes occur in how muscle cells respond to energy. Blood sugar regulation is one of the primary responsibilities of muscle tissue, and when this role is compromised, sarcopenia quietly accelerates. Muscle is the largest site for glucose disposal in the body. Every time carbohydrates are consumed, muscle cells are meant to open their doors, absorb glucose, and either use it for energy or store it safely. When this process functions well, blood sugar remains stable and muscles remain nourished. When it fails, both metabolic health and muscle integrity begin to decline together. Insulin is the messenger that makes this process possible. It signals muscle cells to take in glucose, but insulin can only speak to cells that are willing to listen. Over years of frequent blood sugar spikes, excessive refined carbohydrates, and chronic stress, muscle cells gradually lose their sensitivity to this signal. This condition, often discussed in relation to diabetes, has direct implications for muscle health. Insulin resistance means that muscle cells no longer respond efficiently to the very hormone that supports nutrient uptake and repair. Without proper glucose entry, muscles experience an energy deficit even in the presence of abundant calories. When muscle cells cannot access glucose effectively, they shift into a defensive state. Repair becomes secondary to survival. Protein synthesis slows, and breakdown subtly increases. This is not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual rebalancing toward conservation. The body begins to favor fat storage over muscle maintenance, not because fat is superior, but because muscle has become metabolically expensive in an insulin-resistant environment. Sarcopenia unfolds quietly as part of this adaptation. Blood sugar instability also drives inflammation, which further interferes with muscle repair. Frequent spikes followed by crashes create oxidative stress at the cellular level. Muscle tissue, exposed to this environment repeatedly, becomes less responsive to growth signals. Even when adequate protein is present, insulin resistance blunts the anabolic response. Amino acids circulate, but muscle cells fail to fully utilize them. The message becomes fragmented, and repair remains incomplete. This relationship explains why muscle loss often accompanies metabolic syndrome. Weakness, fatigue, and declining strength are not isolated symptoms. They are reflections of impaired energy handling. Muscle tissue thrives in an environment of steady fuel availability. When glucose arrives in controlled amounts and is efficiently absorbed, muscles remain metabolically active. When glucose floods the system unpredictably, muscles retreat from engagement. Restoring insulin sensitivity is therefore not merely a strategy for blood sugar control, but a foundational step in preserving muscle mass. When muscle cells regain their responsiveness, they once again become primary sites of nutrient utilization. Glucose enters smoothly, energy production stabilizes, and repair processes resume. Muscle protein synthesis becomes efficient because the energetic cost of rebuilding is no longer prohibitive. Diet plays a central role in this restoration. Meals that combine quality protein with natural fats and fiber slow glucose absorption and reduce insulin demand. This creates a calmer metabolic environment where muscle cells can respond appropriately. Over time, insulin receptors regain sensitivity, and the communication between hormone and tissue improves. Muscles are no longer overwhelmed or ignored. They are re-engaged. Physical movement further amplifies this effect. Muscle contraction itself increases glucose uptake independently of insulin. This means that even gentle, regular activity can reopen metabolic pathways that have become dormant. As glucose handling improves, muscles receive consistent energy, reinforcing their role as active tissue rather than expendable mass. Strength returns not solely because of movement, but because movement restores metabolic trust. What makes this process powerful is its reversibility. Insulin resistance is not a permanent state. Muscle cells are remarkably adaptable. When the metabolic environment changes, they respond. Blood sugar stabilizes, inflammation decreases, and anabolic signals regain clarity. Sarcopenia slows, halts, or even partially reverses, not as a miracle, but as a logical outcome of restored physiology. There is also a psychological dimension to this metabolic shift. Stable blood sugar supports cognitive clarity, mood, and motivation. These factors influence dietary choices and physical activity, creating a reinforcing cycle. As metabolic health improves, engagement with the body deepens. People move more confidently, eat more intentionally, and sleep more deeply. Each of these elements further supports muscle preservation. Understanding sarcopenia through the lens of insulin sensitivity reframes aging itself. Declining strength is no longer viewed as a simple passage of time, but as a reflection of metabolic conditions that can be altered. Muscle tissue is not fragile by nature. It is responsive by design. When the environment supports balance rather than excess, muscle remains viable. This perspective also dissolves the false divide between metabolic disease and musculoskeletal decline. They are expressions of the same underlying imbalance. Addressing one inevitably influences the other. By stabilizing blood sugar and restoring insulin sensitivity, the body reclaims its ability to allocate nutrients where they are most needed. Muscle once again becomes a priority rather than a burden. The body does not abandon muscle without reason. It does so when energy handling becomes inefficient and unpredictable. Restore efficiency and the logic changes. Muscle is retained, repaired, and valued as a central component of survival and resilience. Strength becomes less about exertion and more about internal harmony, where glucose flows smoothly, signals are respected, and cells cooperate rather than compete for resources. In this light, sarcopenia is not merely muscle loss, but a metabolic message. It signals that energy regulation has drifted from balance. Responding to that message requires patience and consistency, not force. As insulin sensitivity returns, muscle cells awaken from conservation mode. They resume their role as guardians of glucose, protectors of stability, and reservoirs of strength. Rebuilding quietly as metabolic order is restored and the body remembers how to nourish what keeps it capable, grounded, and resilient over time. Inflammation is often discussed as if it were an emergency response, something dramatic and obvious, yet the kind that erodes muscle works quietly, almost invisibly. Chronic, low-grade inflammation does not announce itself with pain or fever. It settles into the background, subtly altering how cells communicate and make decisions. Muscle tissue is especially sensitive to this environment. When inflammatory signals are persistently elevated, the body interprets its surroundings as unstable and unsafe. In such conditions, building new tissue becomes a risk rather than a priority. From a biological perspective, inflammation is a signal of threat. It tells the body that resources may be needed elsewhere, that damage is ongoing, that energy should be conserved for defense rather than growth. Muscle repair is energetically expensive. It requires coordinated gene expression, protein synthesis, and cellular remodeling. When inflammatory markers remain high, muscle cells receive the message that now is not the time to invest. They slow down repair pathways and increase breakdown, not out of dysfunction, but out of protective logic. This is why people can consume adequate protein and still fail to maintain muscle if inflammation is unresolved. The nutrients may be present, but the internal environment discourages their use for rebuilding. Amino acids circulate in the bloodstream, yet muscle cells remain resistant to anabolic signals. Inflammation interferes with insulin signaling, growth hormone activity, and mitochondrial efficiency, creating multiple barriers to muscle preservation. The body chooses survival over strength. One of the most common drivers of chronic inflammation is dietary excess combined with nutritional deficiency. Highly processed foods introduce compounds that irritate the immune system while failing to provide the micronutrients required to resolve that irritation. Over time, the immune system remains mildly activated, never fully standing down. Muscle tissue exists within this biochemical noise, constantly exposed to signals that discourage repair. This is not aging at work, but a prolonged inflammatory conversation driven by daily inputs. Inflammation also increases oxidative stress, which damages muscle cell components and impairs their ability to function efficiently. Mitochondria, the energy centers of muscle cells, are particularly vulnerable. When mitochondrial function declines, energy production becomes inefficient. Muscle cells struggle to meet the demands of repair and maintenance. The body responds by reducing muscle mass, lowering its energy requirements to match diminished capacity. Sarcopenia emerges as an energy-saving adaptation. Stress, both physical and psychological, further amplifies this process. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, a hormone that increases muscle protein breakdown and suppresses immune resolution. In small amounts, cortisol is adaptive. When persistently elevated, it reinforces inflammation and accelerates muscle loss. Modern life often maintains cortisol at levels the body was never designed to sustain. Muscle tissue becomes collateral damage in a system perpetually preparing for threat. What makes chronic inflammation particularly damaging is its subtlety. People may feel functional while their muscles quietly weaken. Balance declines, recovery slows, and fatigue increases, often attributed to age or lifestyle rather than internal inflammation. By the time weakness becomes noticeable, the inflammatory environment has often been present for years. The body has been signaling for change long before symptoms appear. Reducing inflammation is not about suppression, but about resolution. The body possesses sophisticated mechanisms to turn off inflammatory responses once a threat has passed. These mechanisms depend on adequate intake of anti-inflammatory nutrients, healthy fats, minerals, and antioxidants. When these elements are present, inflammatory signals subside, and tissues receive permission to rebuild. Muscle cells respond quickly to this shift, reactivating repair pathways that had been on hold. Sleep plays a critical role in this process. Deep, restorative sleep lowers inflammatory markers and supports hormonal balance. During sleep, the body assesses damage and allocates resources for repair. If inflammation remains high, this nighttime restoration is compromised. Muscle tissue misses its primary window for rebuilding. Over time, poor sleep and inflammation reinforce each other, creating a cycle that accelerates muscle decline. Movement also influences inflammatory tone. Gentle, regular physical activity reduces inflammatory markers and improves circulation, delivering nutrients to muscle tissue more effectively. In contrast, excessive or poorly recovered exercise can increase inflammation, especially in an already stressed system. The goal is not exhaustion, but signaling safety. When movement feels sustainable, the body interprets it as a sign of stability and allows muscle maintenance to continue. As inflammation decreases, a profound shift occurs in how the body allocates energy. Resources once reserved for immune vigilance become available for tissue repair. Muscle cells regain sensitivity to growth signals, insulin responsiveness improves, and protein synthesis resumes. Strength returns gradually, often accompanied by improved mobility and confidence. This restoration is not dramatic, but deeply stabilizing. Understanding sarcopenia through the lens of inflammation reframes the conversation around strength. Muscle loss is not simply about disuse or insufficient protein. It is about whether the body feels safe enough to build. Inflammatory environments signal danger, scarcity, and unpredictability. Calm environments signal abundance, stability, and opportunity. Muscle tissue responds accordingly. The body is not opposed to strength. It withdraws strength when strength becomes a liability. Reduce inflammation, and strength becomes an asset again. This is why addressing inflammatory drivers often produces improvements that seem disproportionate to the intervention. Muscles respond quickly once inhibitory signals are removed. At its core, chronic inflammation is a message about imbalance. It reflects a system under constant pressure, lacking the resources or conditions to return to equilibrium. Muscle tissue mirrors this imbalance in its gradual decline. Restoring balance requires patience and consistency, not force. As inflammatory signals quiet, the body reassesses its priorities. Muscle repair moves back onto the agenda, not as a fight against aging, but as a return to biological sense. Where growth and maintenance resume naturally in an environment that no longer demands constant defense. Muscle is often framed as a reward for effort, as though it were earned purely through repetition and strain, yet this view overlooks a more fundamental truth. Muscle growth and preservation are governed less by how intensely the body is challenged and more by whether the internal environment can support adaptation. Exercise provides a stimulus, but metabolism determines the response. When metabolic balance is present, even modest activity can preserve strength. When it is absent, no amount of effort can fully prevent decline. Metabolic balance refers to the body's ability to efficiently manage energy, hormones, and nutrients. It is the state in which blood sugar remains stable, inflammation is controlled, and anabolic signals are respected. In this state, muscle tissue is not perceived as a burden but as an asset. The body allocates resources toward its maintenance because doing so enhances overall stability. When balance is lost, muscle becomes expendable, regardless of how often it is used. This explains why people can exercise diligently yet continue to lose muscle mass. Physical activity alone cannot override metabolic dysfunction. If insulin resistance is present, nutrients struggle to enter muscle cells. If inflammation remains elevated, repair pathways are suppressed. If cortisol dominates, breakdown exceeds synthesis. The body may perform the movements, but the biochemical response remains muted. Effort without balance becomes motion without adaptation. Dietary composition plays a decisive role in establishing this balance. Meals that repeatedly spike blood sugar force the body into cycles of excess and correction. Insulin surges followed by crashes create metabolic noise that disrupts muscle signaling. In contrast, meals built around quality protein, healthy fats, and natural fibers provide steady energy and clear signals. Muscle cells thrive in predictability. When fuel arrives consistently and calmly, they remain metabolically engaged. Hormonal balance is equally important. Muscle tissue responds to a network of hormones that include insulin, growth hormone, thyroid hormones, and sex hormones. These signals are sensitive to sleep, stress, and nutrition. When any one of these systems is disrupted, muscle adaptation falters. Excessive training in a hormonally imbalanced state exacerbates the problem. The body interprets repeated stress without resolution as a threat and adapts by conserving rather than building. Inflammation further complicates this relationship. Chronic inflammation alters gene expression within muscle cells, reducing their capacity for growth. It interferes with mitochondrial function, limiting energy production. Even with adequate calories, muscles may experience energetic scarcity. The body responds logically by reducing muscle mass to match diminished capacity. Exercise performed in this state may increase inflammation further, deepening the imbalance. This perspective challenges the cultural emphasis on intensity. While progressive resistance is important, it must be matched to the body's ability to recover. More is not always better. In metabolically balanced individuals, small increases in activity produce meaningful gains. In imbalanced individuals, aggressive training accelerates decline. The difference lies not in discipline, but in internal readiness. Restoring metabolic balance often produces improvements in muscle strength without dramatic changes in exercise routines. Blood sugar stabilizes, inflammation subsides, and hormonal rhythms normalize. Muscle cells regain sensitivity to anabolic signals. Protein synthesis becomes efficient. In this environment, the same workout that once produced fatigue begins to produce strength. The body responds not because effort increased, but because conditions improved. This also explains why muscle preservation improves with dietary changes even before exercise habits change. When metabolic stress decreases, muscle breakdown slows. Repair resumes. Strength stabilizes. Movement becomes easier, which in turn encourages more activity. A positive cycle replaces the previous struggle. Muscle growth becomes a consequence of balance rather than a battle against decline. Age amplifies the importance of this relationship. As the body becomes less resilient to metabolic stress, precision matters more than intensity. Recovery takes longer, and errors accumulate more quickly. Supporting metabolic balance becomes essential for maintaining strength. This does not mean avoiding effort, but aligning effort with capacity. The goal shifts from exhaustion to sustainability. The nervous system also plays a role. Chronic stress keeps the body in a state of alert, diverting resources away from growth. Muscles in a stressed body remain tense but undernourished. Relaxation is not laziness. It is a prerequisite for adaptation. When the nervous system settles, muscle tissue receives permission to rebuild. This permission is biochemical, hormonal, and energetic. Understanding muscle through this lens restores dignity to the aging process. Declining strength is not a personal failure or an inevitable fate. It is feedback about internal balance. Address the balance, and strength often returns to the degree that conditions allow. The body is not fragile. It is responsive. This approach also reframes exercise as communication rather than punishment. Movement tells the body what is needed. Metabolic balance determines whether the message is received. When the message is clear and the environment supportive, muscle adapts gracefully. When the message is shouted into chaos, it is ignored. Muscle tissue is adaptive by nature. It grows when it is useful and supported. It shrinks when it is costly and unsupported. Effort alone cannot change this logic. Only balance can. This balance is not static. It is renewed daily through food choices, sleep quality, stress management, and thoughtful movement. When metabolic balance is restored, exercise becomes effective again. Strength training regains its purpose. The body responds with efficiency rather than resistance. Muscle mass stabilizes or increases, not as an act of defiance, but as a reflection of internal harmony. Sarcopenia, in this context, is not simply muscle loss, but a signal that the internal environment no longer supports adaptation. Responding to that signal requires less force and more attention. When balance is re-established, muscle once again becomes an ally rather than a casualty, maintained not by intensity alone, but by a system that is finally able to support the strength it has always been capable of sustaining. Muscle is rarely spoken about in terms of dignity, yet its presence or absence shapes how a person moves through the world in the most intimate ways. It determines whether rising from a chair is effortless or deliberate, whether balance feels natural or uncertain, whether the body feels like a companion or a burden. Strength is not merely about power, it is about autonomy. When muscle declines, independence quietly contracts, often long before illness appears. Sarcopenia is therefore not just a physical change, but a lived experience that influences confidence, participation, and self-trust. Muscle acts as a buffer between intention and reality. It allows the body to respond to sudden demands, to catch itself during a stumble, to carry groceries, to climb stairs without calculation. These abilities are often taken for granted until they begin to fade. When muscle mass decreases, everyday tasks require conscious planning. The world subtly shrinks. This is why muscle preservation matters far beyond aesthetics or athleticism. It protects engagement with life itself. From a biological standpoint, the body prioritizes what it believes will support survival. Muscle is preserved when it contributes to resilience. When nutritional and metabolic signals suggest scarcity or instability, muscle becomes negotiable. This trade-off may make sense in extreme conditions, but in modern life, it often occurs unnecessarily. The tragedy is not that the body lets go of muscle, but that it does so in response to signals we can change. Nutrition plays a central role in this conversation. Food is not merely fuel, it is instruction. Each meal tells the body what kind of future to prepare for. Diets that lack essential nutrients communicate uncertainty. The body responds by conserving energy and reducing non-essential tissue. Diets that provide complete nourishment communicate stability. The body responds by investing in structures that support long-term function, including muscle. Independence in later life is deeply tied to this investment. Muscle supports joint stability, bone density, and coordination. Without it, the risk of falls increases, recovery slows, and vulnerability grows. These outcomes are often framed as inevitable aspects of aging, yet they are more accurately reflections of long-term nutritional and metabolic patterns. The body does not abandon strength without reason. There is also a psychological dimension to muscle loss that is rarely acknowledged. As strength declines, fear often increases. People become cautious, then avoidant. Movement decreases, reinforcing the cycle of decline. This is not weakness of character, but a rational response to diminished capacity. Preserving muscle interrupts this cycle. It sustains confidence and willingness to engage with the world. Muscle also serves as a metabolic reserve during illness or stress. In times of injury, infection, or surgery, the body draws on muscle protein to support immune function and healing. Individuals with greater muscle mass often recover more effectively. In this way, muscle represents preparedness. It is a form of biological savings, accumulated quietly over years of adequate nourishment and care. Dignity in aging is often discussed in abstract terms, yet it manifests in very practical ways. Being able to dress oneself, maintain personal hygiene, and move without assistance preserves a sense of self. Muscle supports these capabilities. Its loss can feel like a loss of identity, not because the person has changed, but because the body no longer responds as it once did. Supporting muscle health is therefore an act of respect for the person within the body. This perspective reframes dietary and lifestyle choices as ethical commitments to future well-being. Eating to preserve muscle is not indulgent or excessive. It is preventative. It honors the reality that strength underpins participation in life. The body responds to this care with reliability, maintaining structures that allow continued engagement. Compassion becomes essential in this understanding. Many people blame themselves for physical decline, unaware of the biological mechanisms at play. They attribute weakness to age or lack of will, when in fact the body has been responding faithfully to years of incomplete signaling. Recognizing this allows for a gentler approach, one that replaces judgment with curiosity and intention. Muscle preservation does not require extreme measures. It requires consistency. Regular intake of nourishing foods, manageable movement, adequate rest, and reduced metabolic stress communicate to the body that strength is still useful. Over time, these signals accumulate. The body adjusts its priorities. Muscle is retained, repaired, and respected. This process also restores trust between the person and their body. When strength stabilizes, fear recedes. Movement becomes expressive again rather than cautious. The body feels capable rather than fragile. This shift influences mental health as much as physical function. Confidence grows from the simple knowledge that the body can still respond. In this light, sarcopenia is not merely a clinical diagnosis, but a social and personal issue. It affects how people participate in families, communities, and daily life. Preventing or slowing muscle loss preserves connection. It allows individuals to remain contributors rather than observers. Strength supports belonging. The human body is designed to age with adaptation, not collapse. Muscle tissue is meant to adjust, not disappear. When supported, it remains functional well into later decades. This is not about defying age, but about aligning with biology. The body does not seek decline. It seeks efficiency. Provide the conditions where strength is efficient, and it will be maintained. Ultimately, preserving muscle is an expression of valuing life in its full span. It acknowledges that the later years deserve vitality, not just survival. Muscle makes life navigable. It allows the body to meet the world with steadiness rather than hesitation. Nourishing muscle is therefore an act of foresight and care, one that affirms the body's role as a lifelong partner rather than a temporary vessel. Supporting resilience, independence, and dignity through quiet biological cooperation that unfolds day by day, guided by choices that tell the body it is worth maintaining strength for whatever lies ahead.